Hello, my name is Julia Sherwood, and I will be reading from My Seven Lives, Jana Juráňová, in conversation with Agneša Kalinová, published in 2012 by the Slovak feminist press Aspect. This is the book, the original, and the English translation done by myself and my husband Peter, which is currently being edited, is due to be published in October by Purdue University Press. The book is the memoir of the journalist and film critic Agneša Kalinová, born in 1924 in Prešov in eastern Slovakia, who died in Munich in 2014. This is a very unusual project for me because, in fact, Agneša Kalinová was my mother, and she was a pretty amazing, unusual person. She had this incredible zest for life and a very unusually positive outlook on life despite everything she'd been through. As you can see in this photograph taken on her 87th birthday in Paris. At the age of 87, she was still into downhill skiing and kept visiting us. We were living in North Carolina at the time, and this photo here was taken in September 2013. I really had no idea that it would be the last picture the two of us would have together. Today is the 15th of July. It would have been my mother's 97th birthday, and I have chosen an extract from My Seven Lives that describes her 17th birthday party and the end of her idyllic childhood. Starting in the fall of 1940, we were prohibited from strolling on the Corso, the main street. Jews were not allowed to show their faces there in the evening. So what we did was create a parallel Jewish Corso. We'd stroll up and down the left-hand side of the main street leading up to the church. This Corso was full of young Jewish men from all over Slovakia who'd been conscripted, but instead of being drafted into the army, they were sent to labor battalions, some of which were deployed in Prešov. We were made to live in a purely Jewish enclave. In the spring of 1941, a decree stated that Jews were no longer allowed to live on the main street, and we had to move out of my grandma's house. The shocking order came at rather short notice. We were given just 2 or 3 weeks. Friends of my parents, Mr. and Mrs. Barkány, were also evicted from their beautiful villa, even though it wasn't on the main street. Someone must have taken a fancy to their house, and they had to leave, which meant that they were in the same boat as us. There was an old family in Prešov, the Čatáris, who had a summer house they didn't use very much. It was out in the suburbs, but not too far from downtown, and it was surrounded by a beautiful park. The river Torisa flowed through it, and it had a chain bridge modelled on the famous one in Budapest. It would gently sway when you crossed it. My parents and my grandmother rented the house together with the Barkány's. The paths in the park were planted with trimmed currant bushes, so in the summer we could pick some fruit. A friend brought his bike, and I would ride around the park among the bushes. There was also a little castle there, a folly. But the most wonderful thing was the little brook that flowed through the garden. Now that we were not allowed to go to public pools, I had my own private swimming pool, although you couldn't really swim there. I couldn't help feeling that we were on an extended summer vacation, although, of course, we were by no means entirely insulated from the dreadful things happening in the outside world. Grim rumors were circulated from the front that the German army was advancing into Soviet territory at an alarming speed. Depressing news kept coming of friends who found themselves in dire straits after losing their livelihood and property. And all the time there was this constant stream of fresh, demeaning regulations. The so-called Jewish Codex, which was signed into law in 1941, obliged all Jews in Slovakia, whenever they were out in public, to wear a Star of David, sewn visibly onto their clothes. In Prešov, however, Jews had been made to wear yellow bands on their sleeves 6 months earlier than that. Hlinka Guard volunteers would sometimes patrol the streets and check if the Stars of David had been sewn on properly. Literally, from day one of the independent Slovak state, some anti-Jewish government regulation or other would hit us every day, followed by some local embellishment. The Jewish Codex was proudly touted by the Bratislava weekly Ľudové noviny as being stricter than the Nazi Nuremberg laws. In addition, a constitutional edict passed on May the 15th, 1942, legalized the deportation of Jews. I met my future husband Laco on New Year's Eve 1940, when Jews were no longer allowed to frequent any restaurants or cafes or go to dances or bars. So, while strolling on our parallel corso, we made plans for a New Year's party. One of my friends, Bandi Vadas, invited our entire extended group of friends. I was 16 and a half. It was my first New Year's Eve party, and it was pretty wild. When we got there, the place was teeming with young people. Everything was topsy-turvy. A drink here, a gramophone there, a radio in another room, some dancing, total bedlam. Bandi, the host, was already totally drunk and had nodded off in the bath, which luckily had no water in it. Laco also turned up. He only came after midnight because in those days he was already writing cabarets for the New Year's radio show. It was broadcast from the Prešov studio, and he had to stay there to make sure everything was working as it should. Someone introduced us and explained what he did. I was awfully impressed. And I asked him to dance right away. He seemed surprised that such a snot-nosed little girl was hitting on him, but he did dance with me. After that, we met quite often, and he was clearly interested in me. We held a kind of open house in a Czatari garden, and all the boys from the Corso used to come and see me there. They were all in their 20s. Laco was the oldest. He was 27 then. As long as the weather was warm and we could be in the garden, neither my parents nor the Barkines had any objections. We brought a gramophone out, one of those you had to wind up constantly after each record. We had piles of records that the young men had brought along. Laco liked to play songs by Voskovec and Verich, his idols. Some of the other young men also knew these songs and sang along. Others, especially Bandi, would bring classical records, and we would listen reverently to Beethoven's symphonies, and maybe even more reverently to Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. We also played jazz and popular songs by Geza Dusík. That summer was truly idyllic. As the garden was big enough, we weren't in anyone's way. That's where I celebrated my 17th birthday. Earlier that summer, Laco took a bunch of photos of me, put them in a little album, and gave it to me as a birthday present. He made me into a real movie star. This is the little album that he made. All my friends were at the party, everyone bringing whatever they could lay their hands on, huge bouquets of flowers and wine. I had the most wonderful 17th birthday party in the garden. For my 18th, I was no longer there. It was just like the Swedish movie, One Summer of Happiness. We danced through another winter. On weekends, we would sit in a large living room with its huge window and alcove. My gentle, patient grandma would sit there reading, glancing at us every now and then. We'd play records, sometimes we'd dance a little, or just listen to music, or get into deep discussions. Sometimes Mr. Barkany would barge in, stop in the middle of the room, and declared that he could not understand us. He said to us, "You're not that young anymore. We're living these terrible, terrible times, and you just keep dancing. I really don't understand you." They just laughed, and after he left and slammed the door, they shrugged their shoulders. I was really upset. Of course they knew that we were living in difficult times. They were bright young men and perfectly aware of what was going on. But this spot here was our world. What else were we to do? On weekdays, I would sew underwear at home to order, and these young men who had been expelled from universities had to go to work and do jobs they hadn't chosen themselves. Most of them perished in the war. In later years, I often thought that it was wrong of Mr. Berghain to scold us, as for many of these young people, these proved to be the last happy moments of their lives. Thank you.